Alright, well, I don't know that the video is working correctly, but the audio is what is important, so we will push on and see about the video. Today is chapters 27, 28, and 29 of Song for a Whale. He called out to anyone, to no one, then stopped to listen. Noises filled the sea around him. Dolphins chattered as they leaped in arcs above the surface. Whales swelled and crashed. Waves bubbled, popped when a school of fish scrambled away. The low songs of the whales traveled through the ocean, a sea full of sounds, with none for him. He reached for those songs he couldn't sing, trying to grab a call when a wave of sound trembled in the water. If only he could catch it, he'd keep it with him until the sound could become part of him. Then he would answer back and make the tremor of his song float through the water like theirs, and they would know him and answer. Was there anything out in the ocean like himself? He kept calling just in case someone was there. Chapter 28. I've had breakfast buffets before, but nothing like the one on the ship. It was more like every breakfast buffet from every restaurant I've ever been in, all shoved into one place. It'd be impossible to try everything. I'd even had the French toast and waffles and pancakes in the same meal. We'd picked a good cruise, even though there hadn't been many choices left. Grandma went to lie by the pool and look out at the ocean while I went to the wildlife lecture. I found my way to the big theater with hundreds of cushy red seats and a stage. It was too early for the presentation, so just a few people were scattered around the theater. Sitting in the middle of the front row was the girl I'd seen by the pool the evening before. Maybe she liked whales too. I pulled my notepad from my pen and put in my pocket as I took the seat next to her. Two people stood on the stage near the podium, fiddling with the microphone, and were getting ready to get the slideshow ready. The one holding the microphone had the same straight black hair and the light brown skin as the girl next to me. I'm Iris. I'm deaf, I wrote on the notepad. I laughed when I read what she wrote back. I'm Benny, not deaf. Good. So she wasn't afraid of me. You like whales? I asked her. Or other animals? Most animals, especially sharks. I'm going to be a shark biologist. Working with sharks? Maybe this girl wasn't afraid of anything. I get to come here with my mom every summer when she's working on the ship, she added on to the note. I pointed to the woman at the podium and Benny nodded. BRB, she wrote. At the front of the stage, she waved her mom over. Sura leaned over to talk to her and looked in my direction when Benny pointed. Sura returned to the computer on the podium while Benny ran back to her seat next to me. People in the audience settled into their seats and turned toward the stage when Sura talked into the microphone. Since we were so close to the front of the theater, I could see her mouth and catch some of what she said. It seemed like Sura was looking at me while she talked, and she held the microphone low enough so that it didn't hide her mouth. Benny must have told her that I was deaf. That morning, Grandma said that she should have requested sign language interpreters for us, but everything happened so fast she didn't think of it until we left. I hadn't thought of it at all, since I didn't know interpreters ever worked on cruises. Soon the lights dimmed and the PowerPoint presentation started. The spotlight stayed on Sura as she narrated over the slideshow, but with all the pictures and video clips and text on the screen, I could follow along without watching her. Alaska, sure enough, had a lot of wildlife. I thought we'd never get to the whales. It was interesting stuff, I had to admit. Black bears weren't as scary as I thought. They pretty much leave you alone. You just have to stay out of their way and make some noise when you're in their area so you won't startle them when they see you. Grizzly bears are a different story. You wouldn't want to come face to face with them whether they expect you or not. After looking at a picture of bald eagles, mountain goats, sea lions, and seals, I nudged Benny and wrote on the notepad, "Any whales?" "Whales are last," she answered. Maybe that was Sura's way of getting everyone to stick around for the whole talk, saving the most interesting animal for last. Finally, we got to the whale part of the presentation. On a slide heading, "Bubble Not Feeding," Sura showed a pod of humpback whales feeding on a bunch of fish. She clicked over to a video titled "Whale Watchers Capture Bubble Not Feeding in Action." The humpback pod worked as a team to hunt for their food. The whales zoomed in on the school of small fish. They circled to drive in the fish into the tighter and tighter group. Once all the fish were in the tight bundle, one whale blew bubbles from his blowhole while the rest continued to circle. That's why they called it bubble net feeding. The fish wouldn't swim through the bubbles, so it kept them in place like a net would. Then the loudest whale would drive below the school of fish and bellowed a feeding call. The bellowing drove the fish into a tighter ball and up to the surface as they tried to escape the sound. I wonder how the whales described who was the loudest and how they decided who was the loudest and who was the best bubbler. Did they have any tryouts or something? I knew that whales were smart from everything I'd read, but that took some serious planning. Maybe Sura would know. At the end of the presentation, I asked Benny if she could introduce me. She nodded and pointed out to the hallway. Sura sat behind the table stacked with books, and people were already lining up to talk to her. She signed the books for passengers who bought them. Benny and I chatted back and forth using the notepad, with some gesturing and pointing thrown in. I got that she and her mom were from northern Canada, which was really cold. The woman in line ahead of us was never going to stop talking. I shifted from one foot to the other while we waited for her to ask 1,000 questions about every species of animal in Alaska or whatever she was doing. Finally, she moved on and Benny introduced me to her mom. Sura held out her hand and said, "Nice to meet you." After shaking her hand, I showed her the question I'd written on the paper. The bubble net fielding. How do they figure that out? She wrote down an answer, then slid the paper over to me. "We're not sure. Amazing, aren't they?" "Okay, yes. But what kind of answer was that?" "But I want to know how they communicate," I wrote. "How they'd come up with a plan for catching fish." I'd worked through with radios enough to know how each part communicates with the next. Shouldn't scientists who study whales know all about how they talk with one another? "That's one fun thing about science," Sura wrote. "The wondering. If we knew all the answers, there wouldn't be anything to search for." Well, that didn't sound like much fun to me, leaving a bunch of questions unanswered. Benny said something to her mom, and Sura's answer looked like, "Great idea." She turned to a page on the notepad and wrote, "Tomorrow, I'll be announcing whale sightings from the bridge. You're welcome to come and join us if you like. You'll get the best views." "Where is that?" I wrote. When I explored the ship, I hadn't seen anything that looked like a bridge. "Deck 8, Benny can show you." That did sound good. Getting the chance to see whales in the wild? Maybe Grandma would like that too. What time? "I'll be up there by 5 a.m. You know what they say, the early bird gets the whale. No, I didn't know anyone who said that, not even my dad. Benny took the notepad and wrote, "Meet for breakfast at 6? "Okay, I'll ask my grandma." Sura wrote, "She's welcome to come too." Grandma wouldn't want to wake up that early, but I'd ask anyway. I wasn't a morning person either, but if that was when whales got up, I would get up too. Do you know Blue 55? I asked Sura. I'm wondering where he's swimming now. I was ready to tell her all about 55 and his song if she didn't know who he was, but she smiled and pulled her phone from her pocket. A blue icon on her phone on the screen was labeled Track 55. The map came up when she opened the app a black dotted line with a blinking blue dot at the end. It looked kind of like a map I'd seen online. That's him? I wrote. Yes. This app shows everywhere his song was last picked up, but it's been a while since anyone's heard him. Sura zoomed in on the map, then pointed behind us and to the right. Out that way, last anyone knew. After thanking Sura and Benny and telling them goodbye, I took the elevator up to the top deck and stood at the railing. I looked in the direction Sura had pointed and felt closer to Blue 55. Chapter 29. Benny waited for me outside the buffet entrance. I told Grandma the night before that she was invited to come with me to watch for whales from the bridge, but when I mentioned the time, she flopped over in bed at the thought of waking up so early just to knock her out. I'll wait for the whales to wake me up at a more reasonable hour. Benny led me through the dining area, and I shrugged as a way of asking, "Where are we going?" She pointed toward the back of the room and gave me a thumbs up. I felt like I was getting used to the ship, but it was full of surprises. Benny led me past lines of people, through one dining area to another, almost to the back of the deck, where there was another buffet line. It served the exact same stuff as the first one, but there wasn't as long a wait. Most of the people stopped in at the first food line they saw, like I had. We had our salmon eggs Benedict and banana waffles took them to an outdoor table with a view of the ocean around us. I set up my notepad and pen between us, and Benny handed me a rolled-up navy blue scarf from her coat pocket. I pointed to myself and mouthed, "For me?" She nodded and pointed to me too. Then she rubbed her arms and pretended to shiver. True, I had been cold, but I didn't know it was that obvious, even with my coat zipped all the way up last night, and the wind chilled my neck and upper chest. "Thanks," I signed. I tied the scarf around my neck, and Benny stood up to show me how to tuck it in under the collar of my coat. Big difference. She wrote on the notepad, "I thought you might want to borrow a scarf since they didn't seem like you had one. You're out of school already?" Benny had told me the night before that her parents homeschooled her, then a boat schooled her when her mom went on cruise ships. I thought about making something up and telling her why I was making something up to tell her why I was there, but I realized I didn't mind telling her the real story, even though we'd just met. I felt like I'd known her for a long time. I shook my head. "No, school's still going on. I had to come now because I want to meet Blue 55. Benny's eyes rose and her mouth dropped open as she read the note. "You're going to meet him? Sorry, I forgot." I waved her off as she reached for a pen. Since I understood what she said, I felt good to share my plan with someone who was excited about the whale as I was. "I hope so," I wrote. "He's supposed to be in Appleton around the time we get there." I hesitated before telling her about the song. She might think it was a dumb idea, but she knew more about whales than I did. Better to find out now if something was wrong with my plan. If she told me it wouldn't work out, I didn't know what I'd do. I made a song for him. The sanctuary workers will play it from the boat when they go to tag him. I looked down at my plate as I slid the notepad to her, then glanced up to see her expression. She smiled and then scribbled on the page, "Can I hear it later?" "Sure." I took the last bite of waffle and smiled back at her. Benny knew more about whales than I did, but she liked my plan. Maybe it really would work. After breakfast, Benny led me to the bridge of the ship, which it turned out was not like a bridge at all, so I wasn't sure how it got its name. It was a giant room that took up right in the middle of the deck. Floor to ceiling, windows wrapped around the entire room, giving us a view in all directions. A long wooden counter topped with the dashboard of screens stretched all across the bridge. So many dials, knobs, buttons, and joysticks filled the counter, I didn't imagine how anyone would ever learn what they all were for. A few overhead screens showed a radar, views of ship, a map of our route, and rows of numbers that must have meant something to someone. A man dressed in black pants and a white shirt with gold stripes on the sleeves stood up at the front of the bridge, looking out. I figured he was the captain. A couple of the other crew members sat in the black leather chairs at the controls. For a few minutes we stood there in our places near the front windows while Sura made announcements into the microphone. Nothing but still waters stretched out ahead of us. Maybe it was the wrong day to look for whales. I turned to Sura and pointed out to our right. At first I didn't see anything. Then a plume of spray shot out into the air. Benny glanced at me and motioned like she was writing with an invisible pen. Humpbacks, she wrote after I handed her my notepad. I looked out at the water again. Even though Sura had binoculars, I didn't know how she could tell what kind of whales they were from so far away. Closer to the ship, a whale got out of the water, then crashed down with a giant splash. It almost didn't even seem real. The whale was about the size of a school bus and was there flying out into the ocean. I turned to Benny to ask, did that really happen? The wonder on her face answered my expression. She must have seen whales 1,000 times, but she still looked thrilled at the sight of them. Another whale breached then behind the wall of splashing water, and it sank beneath the surface again. Seeing them in real life was nothing like looking at pictures or videos. I ran into the windows closest to the whale, who had just leaped up from the water. Benny tapped my shoulder and pointed to the other side of the ship. I looked in time to see another whale crashing down onto the ocean's surface. I had to try to describe all this to Dad. I hoped I'd be able to get across how beautiful they were. These were the whales he'd listened to so much on that old record, the humpbacks, the symphony players. After a while I got better at catching sight of the spray from the whales' blowholes, so I knew where they were. Sura estimated that we were surrounded by about 50 whales. I wondered if Blue 55 ever swam with the other whales, even though they didn't speak his same language. Andy had said he'd swim toward the other whales, then he'd go back swimming alone again. Maybe he'd swam near those whales, but not really with them, kind of like how I was at school. When Benny let me know that her mom was wrapping up the Whale Watch announcements for the morning, I looked at the time and realized we'd been on the bridge for more than 2.5 hours already. Hadn't I just gotten there? Before we left, I wrote a note to Sura. How'd you know there'd be so many humpbacks so far away? She waved me over the table and pulled out a chair for me. From her messenger bag, she removed a folder and flipped through some papers. She found one of them she was looking for. The paper had a bunch of pictures of blow spouts from whales. The top of the page had the heading, "There she blows." Like in Moby Dick, I wrote. Captain Ahab said that when he saw the spout from the whale. I remembered some of the book from the kids' edition that Grandma had given me. I tried to finish it a few times because I wanted to find out if the whale gets away from the people who were hunting it, but I always fell asleep before I got to the end. Sura nodded and wrote, "Each kind of whale has its own spout shape. If I spot them before the wind blows them away the spray, I can identify what kind it is." She pointed to the picture of a humpback. The spray shot up from the whale's blowhole that was shaped like an upside-down teardrop. Some other whales blew out water almost the same shape, but only a taller, thinner teardrop from the humpbacks. Gray and white whales blew a double spouts of water in the shape of a heart. Sarah turned the other page in her notebook, which showed pictures of whales of whale flukes. Those were all different shapes too. If she was close enough to see a whale's tail, she'd know what kind of whale it belonged to. On the paper, I wrote, "What about Blue 55?" and slid it over to Sura. At the bottom of the page, she drew a quick sketch. Blue 55 had a fin on his back like a fin whale, and the tail like a blue whale. Another way he was different from any other. Which brings us to the end of chapter 29.